Hello again and welcome to Unite Now. In this video, I will be chatting with a very special guest about how they are managing the live content in their highly anticipated game, NFL Clash. My name is Arturo. I'm a developer advocate for Operate Solutions. And today we have Ibs Rageh from Nifty Games. Thank you very much for your time, Ibs. How are you?
Doing great. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So before we jump into the technical part, I would like you to tell us a bit about yourself, like your past experience and what you do right now at Nifty.
Sure. So like you said, Ibrahim, or Ibs Rageh for short. I've been in the games industry for about 18 or 19 years. So started in QA at EA down in Redwood City and kind of worked my way through big and small companies alike. Worked my way into engineering, gameplay engineering, UI, tools, kind of you name it. So throughout my career, starting at EA, worked at a small console game company called Page 44 Studios, and worked on a variety of console titles and the first 3 years of Madden football on the iPhone. So that was like early iOS 2.0 days.
Okay.
I kind of learned about that whole ecosystem, and ever since been on mobile. So from Page 44, got acquired by Zynga, was at Zynga for 5 years, worked on a ton of different mobile games there, over to Warner Brothers San Francisco. So I was engineering manager there, working on DC Legends, which was kind of a turn-based RPG-based game, hero-based, like turn-based game, and then on to Harry Potter Wizards Unite. So got a pretty well-rounded experience in a bunch of different genres. And in the Warner Brothers years was more of kind of the project manager, project lead, head of engineering. So kind of guiding tools development, guiding live ops, guiding feature development, DevOps, QA, et cetera. So kind of a little bit of everything. So had this great opportunity, met some great guys here at Nifty, working on casual mobile sports games, real-time head-to-head sports games. And what makes it unique is it's one of the rare companies that got the official NFL and NBA licenses. So working with those two powerhouse of leagues. So working on NFL Clash, which we'll see here today, and then partnering with the NBA for future titles as well. So
Awesome.
kind of at Nifty as a whole, overseeing all technical things. The official title is head of technology. So the delivery of the games themselves, the infrastructure, the tool set we have internally, kind of how we work to make sure that the games are set up to be as successful as possible.
Awesome, and I'm pretty sure you especially with this game, you'll be super successful. I want to ask you: are you a football fan?
Absolutely. So diehard Niners fan. Still recovering from last year. It's not been the greatest year for us, but it was kind of a dream come true. Like I had worked on Madden in the past.
Yeah,
that was awesome as a gameplay engineer, and then the opportunity to work again in casual licensed football games, just an awesome experience, an awesome opportunity. So bring that certain level of fandom to the process, and hopefully that authenticity transfers onto the field.
Yeah, nice. So now, please, let's talk a bit about Nifty Games. Can you share a bit about like the company, the team, and of course, just a brief about NFL Clash?
Sure, absolutely. So it's been around a couple years now. I was employee number 2 or 3 officially, so came in pretty early as a tech hire. But what we're trying to do is, like I mentioned, was creating multiple sports titles. In a similar fashion, very similar to a Clash Royale style head-to-head gameplay. And so it's trying to present like a kind of more casual, streamlined interpretation of football, I should say, to the genre, and then transfer that to other sports as well. But so what we're working on right now is a shared platform, which is basically the underlying tools and technology that we use to operate and develop these games. And so a lot of the tools and workflows that you see here will be applied to all of our games, but NFL is kind of the trailblazer on proving these out and making sure they're ready for prime time, scalable, and work for a distributed team. Nifty as a whole is around 20 to 25 employees, San Francisco Bay Area, LA, and Chicago. So a lot of industry veterans and a very small team. So kind of, we like to use the term kind of like a SWAT team of experts that are able to kind of lead their domains, but then jump in and get their hands dirty and do some of the work themselves if necessary. But working with some great partners, primarily one in Santiago, Chile, Giant Monkey Robot, or GMR. And so great working relationship with them. And so they're leading up the development for the shared platform and the NFL game itself. And we're handling the NBA side of things. So great working partner. They're in the weeds, working very closely with their tech lead and project leads for both projects. And it's been a really good kind of collaborative relationship with them, and then with you guys as well. So obviously we're pretty small, so these tools have been a huge help to develop and operate these games in a way that like we're all used to from big companies like a Zynga or Warner Brothers.
Okay. Yeah, I actually know Juan Pablo from Giant Monkey. Great guy.
Yeah, JP. Yeah, we work with him and chatting with him all day, all night. So he's incredible. So he's leading up the platform team and the NFL team.
Awesome. That's great. And I have another question for you before we jump into the actual operate solutions that you've been using. You're using Unity for creating the game as well, right? Like, what's your experience with Unity, you as a developer?
So let me think. I've been using it since probably I for sure remember the 5.0 days, but it must have been 3.0 or 4.0. So it's been a while.
Okay. Wow.
Doing a lot of kind of R&D and prototype development at Zynga as a UI and gameplay engineer for some casino-related projects and poker-related projects, into some Unity for VR, early days in Oculus, some location-based stuff. And then at Warner Brothers, it was all Unity as well. So DC Legends was built on Unity, as well as Harry Potter Wizards Unite. So I've personally been using it about, if I had to guess now, probably about the last 7 or 8 years, I would say. So a decent amount of time, and initially starting as an engineer within the ecosystem after working in kind of self-developed engines and kind of like internal engines, and then worked our way into Unity, used it for a variety of different use cases. So like as an authoring tool to export assets into a different mobile-friendly engine at the time, like basically exporting into Cocos. But then most powerfully, as of late, just kind of leaning into the whole ecosystem and using not only the editor tools, but then the runtime itself. And as it's gotten better and better for mobile development, just leaning in on that power and flexibility. So
that's great. Thank you for using Unity after all these years. I hope you're still having the same fun as how it was when you started.
Absolutely.
So. Yeah. So now let's jump into another side of Unity, because we briefly talked about the engine, the Unity editor, but what we're going to be focusing today is on the other side, which are the Unity operate solutions, in particular, how to use them to basically have a live game out there. So let's start with one thing that is not necessarily a solution itself, but enables other solutions at Unity that you're using, which is the Addressable Assets system. For all of you who doesn't know what this is, basically it's a Unity editor and runtime asset management system that basically improves the support for large production teams with complex live content delivery needs. So please, Ibs, tell us how you're using the Addressable Asset system.
Yeah, so we jumped aboard the Addressables system maybe 6 or 7 months ago, as we're nearing soft launch for NFL Clash. Really enjoyed the flexibility and the ability to not only have it support local development, but then when we transitioned into an asset bundle kind of CCD world, to serving these updatable bundles for the client development. So we're using it in a kind of somewhat rudimentary of a way. Like, it has a lot more power that we haven't leaned into yet. But the way we are using it currently is by listing all of the assets that we want to be able to load on demand, and really leading into the labeling system so that we can have selective sets of bundles that are loaded on demand for specific needs. So whether it's packaging it into the binary, whether it's loading just the assets to reach the main menu, whether it's loading a level specific, a stadium specific set of assets. So really leaning in on the groups and how we basically lazy load these assets on demand.
Okay. Did you start using I don't know, like the assets folder, and then you said you switched to addressables, like at some point during development?
Yeah, so
how was
probably
that
in
transition?
pre-production or so, we started with just kind of a traditional. We avoided the resources folder as much as possible, just for the
Okay,
sake of
great.
binary size.
Yeah.
But we always kind of had this plan that, and the timeline worked out well, that we knew we needed to get to a CDN or CCD solution for serving asset bundles. And so we had heard good things about the addressables. It was still a little early, but we worked our way through some of the package and library updates. So we knew we wanted to get there, but initially it was very baked into the client, very explicit references to specific assets, which is one of the things that Addressables really helps with, is making sure that initial like spike on load time on performance isn't there, and its own the asset references themselves are what are passed around rather than the assets themselves. So that part has been really great for us. Obviously, as we start to build, and once you get into production, it becomes more and more important as you start to really add a lot of content, a lot of variety. So making sure that you have that in place. We got lucky with our timeline that it was ready for us when we needed to add all these assets and variety. So now that it is more of a kind of hardened system, it's been a great solution for us.
Awesome. I'm happy to hear that. When you're thinking about live games, you're thinking about continuously delivering content, right? Or allowing the players to choose, in a sports game, I guess, to choose their team, to choose or configure their teams. And you want to have flexibility in how these assets are managed, right? You don't want to have like hard references in the code or in the editor. So
absolutely, that's the underlying principle for Nifty as a whole, is trying to minimize the number of client releases and submissions through first party that you can. So as much as you can drive through either deploying new data, deploying asset bundles, deploying backend server code, being able to do that in a seamless way and be able to support multiple versions. It's easier said than done, for sure. And not only that, but once you start down that route, making sure you have a really good plan for your internal workflow and processes, right? So QA needs to know what it's testing and where and how. If bugs arise, you need to be able to actually like very clearly specify what version you are on, what version of the assets or the data, so that engineering can go back in and fix and triage any issues. The permutations explode very quickly if you're not careful. So being sure that you can easily react, but a common phrase that we have at Nifty is, just because you have the tools to do so doesn't mean you should be doing it. Like always being very aware of your team's capabilities, your ability to juggle multiple releases, multiple versions, multiple things in parallel. But having that flexibility to be able to do this without the client and driving it from a CDN solution or deploying data is absolutely critical for live operations.
Awesome, Ibs. Now let's continue with the next step, which is actually building the game, right? Building the game for either testing or for release, for all these steps. You mentioned that you're using Cloud Build. For people who are not aware about what Cloud Build is, it's basically the way to simply and easily create and share builds of your game. It automatically compiles, deploys, and tests your game, so you can iterate quickly with your team. So, Ibs, tell us about how cloud content delivery helped you in your pipeline for development and testing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the build pipeline is obviously a very big and like central part to the whole process, right? Like making sure QA has the builds to be able to test and roll out, and to do so predictably and with confidence that you can churn out builds in a regular cadence at all hours of the night, coming from source control, and very predictable. If you build on the same change list, it'll produce the same build. So it's like a very big central peace of mind set of tech and infrastructure that in my past I've seen go great and I've seen go poorly. So especially with a small company getting started, it was a huge help with Cloud Build, basically closely integrating with our Unity project, with our source control, We started in Bitbucket. We've moved our way over to Perforce, like a lot of Unity, like larger team asset-driven games do. And it seamlessly came along for the ride, and we're able to spin up and configure tons of jobs in parallel, whether it's different streams within Perforce or whether it's iOS, Android, or the bundles themselves, which we'll be getting into. But it scaled with us great. Back before addressables, before asset bundles, we're just producing a binary with all the content baked in, seamless for that, handled all the provisioning and et cetera for us. And then when it came time and getting more and more ready for live operations and soft launch, separating out iOS, Android, separating out the asset bundles and having different jobs there, the different provisioning and signing for development versus release and distribution. So it's scaled with us great. Another huge part of it is that peace of mind, like I was saying, is all of the management of the nodes themselves to build the project is handled for you. And a common pain point on at least iOS development is that the builds to produce the IPA, the binary for iOS, needs to be built on a Mac. And so there aren't very many solutions out there for cloud-based like Mac development and Mac hardware to run these on. Not unlike like a Windows-based build or for Android build. So the fact that Unity abstracts all of that from us and it all just worked has been a huge help. And so we've invested more over time with a variety of jobs for very specific purposes, and then leaning in a little bit to our Jenkins expertise for using another service to help kind of orchestrate the UCB with their REST APIs. So being able to coordinate and kick off nightly builds on a schedule, being able to kick off builds that are pinned to a specific change list to make sure that it's consistent across all of them, and then trust UCB to basically kick off all these builds in parallel and produce all the artifacts necessary overnight or during the days, continuous integration, continuous delivery style with polling to source control. So it's handled it all for us, which has been great.
This is like a common workflow for game studios, right? Like having automated builds. Like you don't want someone like your engineer to be seated there waiting for something to happen and not being able to work. The fact that you could use cloud build, do you think like for smaller developers who don't know that this is like the process or who doesn't have all the infrastructure to create their build pipeline or automated build pipeline, is this something that you will recommend people to take?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a breeze to get set up and integrate directly with the project and with the source control. And in the early stages, when you aren't worrying about bundles or distribution profiles, et cetera, the immediacy of getting it set up was really striking. So yeah, it was a huge help there. And then not only that, but then with its polling ability for source control, just to have builds waiting for you, right? So you don't need to go in there and explicitly kick off a build, but kind of building those reps around and kind of the working habits around the only builds that we test and trust are built from UCB rather than somebody's kind of hodgepodge assembled build pipeline on the local Mac, right? That's not a scalable solution. So if anything, the recommendation is the sooner you get comfortable with it and start to lean in on it as the source of truth for your builds, the happier it'll be, and you'll start to work and improve the functionality. There's a lot of customization and ability to tweak and edit the jobs, and so start to kind of build out your infrastructure around that or outside like we do with Jenkins. But starting as a basic solution, it was perfect.
Awesome. Glad to hear that. Now we already talked about generating our bundles or using addressables. So you now have the content separated from your binary, sort of saying, or most of the content, most of the assets. Now the question is how you distribute that, right? Like there are multiple ways you can roll your own. In this case, you are using Cloud Content Delivery, which is a Unity's content delivery network optimized for games, right? Because there are many others, but ours is optimized with games. So how was the experience using it? How does the implementation looks like on the development side? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was another one that came online even after Addressables did. So again, we got really lucky with the timing here. But it's been an absolute blast working with Matt and the team here to get this kind of making sure that it was addressing our workflow considerations and our live ops and development needs. But from a high level, the way we use it is it's a very basic system of like storing buckets and releases within those buckets, and then using badges to basically be able to dynamically name or version releases within these buckets. And so what we do is our Unity Cloud build, we have builds for iOS and Android, varying degrees of asset quality, so like high and low res textures, for example. And we have our buckets set up in CCD within the Unity portal. And the engineer is basically, the release engineer is responsible for basically promoting releases and badging it accordingly. One of the things that makes it extremely powerful is it's not only the hosting. So like in my past, worked with CDN providers like an Akamai or Google Cloud. So it not only handles the hosting and all the management of the source and like the edge nodes, et cetera, for serving the assets themselves, but it also has this incredible wrapper on top in the web portal to add the release and version management. And so that part alone is an extremely time-consuming thing to create and very risky because you're directing live traffic. You're directing builds to specific versions of assets, which could go catastrophically wrong if you're not careful, right? So the web portal's been great, and the team has been extremely receptive and collaborative around helping define workflows that work for development purposes, which is much more like rolling builds, like CI/CD, nightly builds for QA, and what that means versus the unique needs for a production app where you want to be very safe and explicit. And I want this build to get this set of bundles with this tag rather than a floating version release. So they're all things we can demo in the portal here, but it has worked great for us for both the game team development as well as kind of the live operations in a very safe and kind of methodical way. So it's been a seamless integration for us.
I'm happy to hear that. Also, we've been telling like developers for quite some time when we recommend them, to make the initial download as small as possible because of many other things like the friction with players. You don't want people to say, "Oh, this is too large" or whatever, and you also want the right content to get to the right players, right? Like if I just playing with a team or if I'm just playing, I don't know, with certain skin in any game, I don't necessarily have to download everything that the game has to offer if I'm not going to be using it. So it's great to hear that you're in finding cloud content delivery useful for you, and I hope other people can look at Nifty and say, okay, this team is using it, so I'll take a look at that. And also, to me, it's very interesting to know it's very interesting when people like you yourself that have been in the industry for quite some time, that these things exist already, and they have existed for many years. But the challenge sometimes is like, okay, but it's hard and it's difficult to make them and to implement them and to see like, what do I need to even get started with these? So this service is something that people can just basically use. And if they're using Addressables, such as yourselves, you can get the most out of both things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way I describe it is like big company kind of tools and best practices for this asset management, but easily accessible for the little guys, right? Like we started out very small and like we didn't have the tools team to build this out, neither the time nor the expertise, nor the risk profile, right? Like we needed something to work. And so this has been huge. It's replicated and brought the best practices from the big companies that I've been a part of and a lot of the other developers have been a part of, and made it accessible to us right out of the box. So it was great.
Awesome. So we're about to wrap up. There's one extra thing that we have to talk about, and is Unity Remote Config. Basically, Unity solution and Unity package that lets the developers configure anything that's delivered to Unity's runtime via native editor workflows or programmatic access. First, I would like to ask you, Well, you're using remote config. The question here is, why would you want to remotely configure the player experience or the game of someone?
Yeah, so we use it probably a little bit differently than you would initially think.
Okay.
So for us, it's less around game design and more around the routing of clients and the routing of the apps to get the appropriate content. So we use it kind of as the source of truth for the orchestration of all these services, right? So it, as an example, the first thing that the client does is it has some identifying information. I'm an iOS app. I'm in North America. I'm running on an iPhone 12, so high definition, and I'm on this build number as an example. And it reaches out to remote config and says, this is how I identify, like, where do I go? And remote config serves up via a set of rules and tags. It serves up all of the different endpoints and content that we need to operate the game. And so that's like the most integral piece around being able to operate live and be able to subdivide our player base, test updates safely without affecting our players, redirect builds without having to rebuild the binaries. So we use that as that first endpoint. And so it's obviously very important, like if something goes wrong, like we're in trouble, right? So we have some fallbacks in place, but using it to point into what our backend URLs are, what our CCD bucket name is, or badge names are, any of the configurable endpoints for chat servers or whatever it may be. Remote config is responsible for serving that up. And then because of its immediate nature, we can make edits on the fly to redirect subsets of devices or builds to different environments as we see fit. And it all just works from there. So it takes a lot of the stress out and really is the like central piece to how we operate in a way that minimizes the number of times we need to build new binaries for iOS or Android.
That's pretty cool. It's pretty cool how you're using this because, I think there are many use cases for when you want to remotely configure like what the player is seeing or how the game is behaving or etc. And another very cool thing that I see about this is how you're using this ecosystem of Unity services and platforms to create your game, which is it's exciting, right? Because it's great when someone uses one thing or another thing, but when you see like the full story and how you're connecting all these dots for your game is extremely interesting. So you want us to show us something?
So I can dig in kind of in the order of operations that we started in. Let me get screen set up here. So I'll go through the web-based tools first, and then I can show you a concrete example of how we use how we can redirect a build between environments, and then how we can redirect to a different set of asset bundles using the CCD badge system. Okay. So from a high level, starting at cloud build, you got, as you can see here, we have tons and tons and tons of jobs. You can see some examples of like, for example, here, a release 0.8.6, which is one of our version numbers, CDN content for Android or iOS. So you see different versions here that are all linking to specific source control streams, as an example, 0.8. And so all the configuration within here, all the signing credentials is all handled. You'll see various feature branches. You'll see a lot of our production-based apps as well. So we have a milestone or a production app that we will then export and upload into the first-party portals. So they have the distribution certificates here that we're talking about. So all of this is completely customizable, and the production apps themselves won't have addressables built within them, but we leave it up to the CDN or CCD jobs here as an example to be able to authenticate with our CCD bucket names and deliver to the right bucket accordingly. And so when the build job completes, it automatically deploys it into the bucket, and it's waiting for basically the engineering to hook up the wires. So a combination of CCD and remote config, which I'll get into in a second. But so a lot of configurable jobs here. Things are going throughout the day. You'll see a lot of concurrent builds moving. Some of them are considered automatic, like CI/CD style polling. Some of them are much more explicit. We just don't need to build up the queue too much, but you can see a lot of our queue here with all the different types of jobs. using tagging systems to tag versions so that we know and can preserve a working history of where we are. And then within there, you can click into and see the details of the job up above. So this is really handy for us. Everything for us comes back to source control being, and specifically for us, Perforce being the source of truth. So as you can see, if we tag a build, you can look into the information for this build, for example, and look at the commit number. So this is the change list within Perforce. And so everything goes back to that. So if something goes wrong, we can assess and see within Perforce, hey, what was the state of the code or the data that produced this build, and we can fix from there. So all of the builds come through here, and then we would then either share with the team via the build sharing interface for specific people that are a little more technically savvy, or distribute through the first-party portals, whether that's TestFlight or Google Play Store. So typically we would just download these and upload them into the portals accordingly.
How would manual workflow look like if you wanted to have all these? I can imagine it will be kind of like a nightmare to have so many builds. And
yeah, exactly. So that's where Jenkins came into play. So we can, within here, you can trigger and you can see all the different jobs, right? So we never trigger all, because that would just be crazy at this point. We have 30 or 40 different configurations. So typically what you would do would be you would either trigger an individual one within here, but the risk of that, especially if you're producing builds for multiple platforms and bundles and binaries, is that the source control sync happens when the job starts. And so to ensure that you're hitting the same changes, like if it's in the middle of your workday, people are committing to source control all the time. And so making sure that they're all produced with the same build, Cloud Build offers a great REST API with a ton of documentation and a great kind of developer website to see what the endpoints are. And that's where Jenkins comes into play. And so if we go through Jenkins here, I can show you kind of our orchestration. And so this was kind of moonlighting as a build engineer here based on previous history. What we ended up doing is we have a couple different jobs here that handle the orchestration within UCB. And so we have like a multi-job trigger, which is like the meat of it, the coordination of multiple jobs. We have overnight, which is basically just on a cron job. So every night at 11 p.m., it'll kick off in jobs. And then we have the single job trigger, which is what's responsible for actually calling the REST API for UCB.
Yeah.
And so what you see when you dig in, if I run one of these as an example, you can pin a specific Perforce change list. You can have the option to clean the build, and then you can select your projects, right? So NFL, NBA, or an SDK. And so depending on this, I can have live updating. Here are the different jobs within UCB that I've exposed. And so what I can do is I can then basically click multiple jobs. Let's say I want to build distribution production for iOS and Android, and I find a specific Perforce change list, I don't know, 18,444. And so if I hit build, then it'll go through and iterate through all the jobs that I've selected and call into UCB and trigger them all with this pin change list, so that no matter when they start, based on available resources, I'm guaranteed to have that same snapshot of source control. And so it'll produce nice, consistent builds, really leaning into the ability to kind of parallelize and distribute those. And so as an example, what we would do overnight would be I can configure a specific job, or I can configure a specific set downstream and basically list all the jobs that I want to run. And at 11 p.m., like clockwork every night, it just kicks off all these jobs in parallel with the same Perforce change list. So we'll have accounting here, but yeah, it's kind of that orchestration layer. It was really, really important as we started to get the need for parallel builds that are built consistently.
Yeah, that's looks impressive. Thanks for sharing this, and thanks for the openness to share this pipeline with everybody. So now you want to show us how you're using CCD and remote config.
Yeah, absolutely. So we start with CCD just to kind of show the building blocks. Like I mentioned before, it's all bucket based. And so we have different categories for iOS or Android or different releases as an example. So you'll see here the Ibs test bucket, which I'm going to be using today to show you a simple example of using badges for the client. But you can see the various projects we have, various versions right here. We stopped using versions as much, and we started basically when we're in development, we'll be using these buckets. But what makes this really powerful is that you can promote a release from or between buckets. And so the rolling development will be in one of these buckets as an example. Like, let me find one that we did recently, release 08.6. And you can see all, like, here are the different bundles we have. You can see rolling release, right? Because this is hooked up to CI/CD, you'll see a lot of rolling releases with release notes here. And so it automatically adds the latest badge. And so for development purposes, you don't want to have a cumbersome workflow. You want QA to just publish builds and is always pointing at the latest and greatest content. And so for development, we always lean in on just using latest. And I'll get into that with remote config and how that's configured. But when we're ready to promote to production, the power of this is I can actually just take a release and promote it out. And so I can promote it and I can pick the target bucket, and I would pick, for example, production iOS and it brings along the release notes, but I would basically promote that in there. But as I mentioned before, for production, we're very, very explicit. We don't want to have this rolling release, because if you make an accidental promotion of a release, you don't want all your players automatically going. You want that peace of mind that QA gives you sign off selectively. Yeah. And so as an example, you can see within production, you can come in here and see the releases, and we have, using the badges, we have a very explicit 816, 816.1, 2, 3, 4. Anytime the live operations, let's say we want to add a new store pack art or a new event to the game and we need new assets, we would publish the new version. You have the latest tag, but there's no official like name tag, and QA tests against the latest. And once sign off is ready, then we basically add the named version and update remote config to say, hey, everybody in the wild, you're going to this production iOS bucket and looking for badge 869_3. And the next time they launch the app, they just get, using addressables in the addressable system, they get only the asset bundles that have changed, download the new content, and they're good to go. So a very explicit process here, leaning in heavily for the badge system, and then a very separate workflow for development builds and production builds. We can circle back when we get to like an actual on-device demo. I can circle back around the tangible workflow for this test bucket, but digging into remote config and how the routing happens, I'd imagine.
Please show us that part.
Like I said, this is the initial kind of how we use it to route the live game, and so very configurable here with as many rules et cetera as you need. So you can see the different development environments that we have, and then the type of information that we serve within. And so as an example, we have different versions that are live on production, version 869 or 871, and those can then return a subset of data. And so, for example, here you'll see some tangible examples. Here are the rules, and it's like a very basic JavaScript set of rules. But you can basically, this is how the app identifies itself. And so you can see if it is a quote unquote staging build, or and here you can see some device overrides. So I'd imagine, because this is a live view, QA is testing something on our staging environment, so they only want a subset of devices going, so they can explicitly add themselves. And then underneath here, you'll see all of the different key value pairs that are returned to that client hitting remote config. So the Photon app ID, PlayFab we're using as our backend, any URLs, asset bundles are very important, as I'll get into in a second. But this is basically what's getting served back to the client on that initial request. And so it knows where to go to get its content to run itself. So as I mentioned, we have one for different environments, and then using priorities, you can also, like you can see, it can get out of hand. So having somebody clearly defining the set of priorities and making sure it doesn't get too complicated, but they can satisfy multiple rules where we can serve production bundles to everybody, but then override it for a subset. Like we have friends and family tests, right, for soft launch. So we can serve a specific set of bundles that might, for example, disable in-app purchases. And so we remove those assets accordingly, or don't serve those, or send separate debug flags for that type of build. So we can do things like enable debug functionality just for a subset of devices for internal developers, even though it's on production. And so it's a really live way to really dictate and drive the client behavior as well as that initial routing. So digging in here, you can...
I have a question for you, Ibs. Who is ultimately responsible for coming into the dashboard and making these changes?
So typically it would be the lead engineer or the project lead. just because they're the most aware of, basically it's whoever's in charge of the distribution of the backend environments, what versions are being used or mapped to where. And so it's like the release manager, lead engineer, depends on how you have your team set up. We have some basic like user accounts and permissions set up so that not everybody can access this, obviously, because you can imagine this can be catastrophic if you make a mistake. And so having some kind of built-in logging solutions to let you know, like if traffic dies out for some reason, oh, maybe somebody made a mistake. But typically it's that release manager that's distributing the builds because they know how they identify what the configuration tag is, etc. And it comes in through here.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks.
So from that point too, like another way we do use this in another great way is that if a build comes out and it has, like I say, we bake in a specific tag and that tag is used for the actual identification. So as an example, you can see if the environment equals production 869, right? So that the binary that's live in the App Store has this tag production 869. And so it says, oh yeah, this is the production release. And so return these key value pairs. Consequently, if we're ready to retire a build, if it doesn't find any matching rules, we just remove 869. And the client then says, hey, I reached out to remote config, but it didn't have any environments for me to go to. Display the hard gate prompt or the update prompt and direct them to the App Store. And so you can do some custom routing that way too, which is basically our soft upgrade prompt or hard gate prompt to be able to retire old versions or recommend and coax people into upgrading. You can do it through the system as well.
Awesome. This is incredible to see all these things that you have well thought, that you have in place for all these different cases. Like the friends and family example it's great. You know, you don't want to, or I don't know, but in most cases, the only thing that might be changing is the actual content, right? Like the
small subset, exactly. So
right.
As an example, it's not even the content necessarily. So you can see here, we're sending down different debug options, asset bundles, and a game data version. And within, like if you go in and edit this, you can start to actually dig into, it's raw JSON. And so we want to build tools around being able to do this a little more conservatively, to do some like JSON validation and parsing, et cetera. But as you can see, like we have flags here. So we can basically, the feature for IAP for Android, set level unlock to -1, which basically disables it. And so in this, the debug options, the client can then interpret in real time when it launches. We can enable or disable specific SDKs. We can show matchmaking statistics. And so like if there's something that we want friends and family because they have a direct level of communication back with us as developers, we might be able to selectively add a couple more debug options so that they can help us with the development. Versus the live playing audience, you would never want to display debug text or the ability to contact us directly, as an example. And so we can use that as a way to use this as a way to live drive that information.
Also, you are going to show us like a demo on device, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So getting you kind of set up with how we have this configured. So I have a live production app on my phone that came from TestFlight. And then in the web portal, a couple of things to show. First with remote config. So I went in here and I have a very specific Ibs device override rule. And all it has listed in here is my device ID, which is the PlayFab ID, not like UDID or anything like that. It's custom to PlayFab. And so I just list my device ID. And if I have this device ID listed, I'm returning unique debug options, asset bundles, and a PlayFab title ID. And so from a high level, very quickly, the PlayFab title ID, I'm actually overriding so that I don't send myself to production. I want to send myself to our staging environment. And so right off the bat, when I launch, I'll be tweaking these values live here, and I'll show you the screen share from the device. But you'll see my production account loaded and my progression, my whatever level 5 progression, and then I'll switch it over to staging, and you'll see a different landing screen because I'm on a different environment with different player profile. But then more specifically for the Unity tools, the asset bundles, like what I mentioned before with the bucket ID and the tags, we have defined out here for iOS. Here's the bucket ID, and then the badge, I just created a name called live. And so if I go back into my test bucket that I built from UCB and then deployed here, I built the latest and greatest that was on production. So it's exactly as the app appears to players, live assets, and I named it live as a badge. And then I also updated the main menu's play button color and text color. And so what I did here is I added a badge called Play Button Update. And so what I can do is when I jump into the device, I'll launch the game and you'll see the live update in production. I'll relaunch, you can see the live update in staging, so it'll be a different player account. And then I will go into remote config and update the badge name. All I do would be come in here and I would type in, well, I believe I called it Play Button Update, etc., and save it. And then next time I launch the app on my device, it would download just that bundle that changed, and it would load that, and you'd see it reflected in the build itself. All the different versions of our apps, like I mentioned. So we have Milestone, different SDK, etc. The blue app icon on the upper right is our production app. And so what I'm going to do here is I set back to remote config. I set it back so it's loading the production version. So when I launch it here, you'll see it launch the splash screen, go through the initial loading, of which we are optimizing via addressables and CCD. And then once I get to the main menu, this is my production level account. So Nifty Ibs up top, my Ranch Jellies clan, which is a bunch of my college buddies, level 5. And so you can see the stadium progression. And yeah, so this is welcome to NFL Clash. This is kind of the landing page here. And so moving through, you can see the different card-based gameplay we have here. You can see the store, etc. So all the different live content that we have. And so this is what's live currently in some territories, upcoming events, etc. And so yeah, this is my production. And so if I quit this now, and I can quit the app, I come back into remote config, and give me 1 second while I get this app ID, and I will enable it to reroute to staging. So basically now, so I hit save. And so now it's saved. So when I launch the app again, you'll see coming back to a completely different landing page because it's using a debug account from a completely different environment. And so when it makes it through, you'll see one of the earlier training stadiums as an example, right? And so upper right or upper left, just a different profile, 0 trophies. I have a chest waiting for me, completely different environment. And so one of the things I mentioned before was when you start adding this level of flexibility, you really need to be able to make sure that you know what you're testing and where. And so as an example, via remote config, via those debug flags, what we have the ability to enable or disable specific debug text, like debug menus, like really basic, like developer only style stuff. We can enable, disable that for anybody we want to. But then also within settings, we have an information button that will show us endpoints and all the identifiers. Basically, this is what remote config serves us for our endpoints. And so I can validate the PlayFab title ID. I can validate my environment, my CCD badges or buckets, etc. So now that I'm on staging, you can see and take notice here of I have the big orange play button right in the middle, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to quit out of the app, and in remote config, I'm going to go back in. I'm going to replace that badge name like I mentioned. So it's going to, instead of live, it's going to say play button update. And so coming in and just replacing that text, play button update, and hit save. And so this is that separate set of bundles that was deployed as a different release that we explicitly named. And now that it's saved, when I launch the app for the third time, I likely already have it downloaded because I was going through the dry run of this, but it would have downloaded that new bundle. And because I explicitly sent just my device to use that new badge, when I get to the main menu here, you'll see it's a different color, and the prefab itself was updated accordingly. Nice. So a typical workflow would be QA would come in and whitelist a couple devices, or for example, whitelist a couple devices, get sign off, and then we can promote and we can update the badge name for the live player audience, and everybody gets that at one time. But another common use case and workflow is when you're preparing that new binary for the next release, as an example, you want to build your binary one time and have the confidence that you're not rebuilding and you're not introducing new bugs be your build scripts for a unique special case for that production app. And so as long as it's that same binary, you can rest assured that what you've tested and signed off on is what's going to your player base. So by being able to do it this way with remote config, we have that one version, and we might get final sign off on our staging environment. We might even submit to first party with the pointing to staging, which is a very safe thing to do, like kind of a walled garden, not affecting our live players. And because remote config and that binary identifies itself as production 900 as an example of a version number, we can test that in isolation and not affect our live players at all, because the labels and buckets and everything for that particular build is only being served to that one particular binary. So when the players organically go through and update in the App Store, they'll get the new rule and the new information from remote config, go to the new endpoints, grab the new content, and play as is. But if they're on the old build, it's business as usual. So it provides a lot of relief and kind of it avoids complexity around trying to maintain backwards compatibility, et cetera, making sure your assets or your data works for both. You can just serve them different assets in a very live fashion.
That was fantastic. Thank you for sharing us like the inners of the game, the inners of your workflows. I'm pretty sure that other developers with maybe less experience will find this like extremely useful, because these are not trivial things to come up with, right? Like even if the tools are there, well, you have to know like, okay, these are some use cases that you might need to tackle or something like that. And I always love when the demonstrations come from real world examples. Like my job is to make demos, but usually they are not real world examples. So while I was seeing this and thinking, oh wow, this is actually going to be running on millions of people's devices. So it's great to learn from you. And again, I appreciate you and Nifty's openness to share. So thank you again. And any advice, any final words for people watching you? Anything you want to say?
Final advice. Well, thanks for the opportunity to present. We're pretty proud of kind of cobbling together a lot of systems, right? Like that in a somewhat unique of a way. So I'm very appreciative of the support and the iteration and collaboration. It's been great. Like we wouldn't be here without this collaboration. It allowed us to focus on making the game itself, right? So that's been a huge help for us. Advice, I would go back to what I was talking about earlier, which is like, just because you have the tools doesn't mean you should be using all of them, especially at the same time. And so being very clear around introducing the tools when your team is ready. We have a lot of flexibility and power here. We also have a lot of flexibility and power to shoot ourselves in the foot. And so being very deliberate about, if you're rolling something out and like, okay, now we're ready to deploy asset bundles into the CCD and serve it live, make sure your team's ready for that. Make sure QA and production's ready. Make sure you have the ability to really know what you're testing, because otherwise the level of complexity and the permutations and the confusion that introduces will sink a project. So being very clear and deliberate around, hey, we can get away with just packaging everything in the binary right now for developers. And then when we're ready for it, we'll get to it. But not underestimating the amount of time or the changes to workflow that entails. So a very deliberate process. Like we didn't start with all of these services overnight, right? Like we added layer upon layer, and we had that finish line in mind, and we're still not there even. Like we still have some ideas of how we want to extend this, make it a little more like failure proof, add more validation. But like the end goal for us is, it shouldn't even be an engineer that's doing this, right? We want to empower all the other disciplines to be able to do this. So QA knows they're the ones that are in the weeds the most. They can drive and promote between different environments. They can handle the mapping. They can handle the routing of different devices or builds to specific environments for sign-off, as long as we provide it to them in a way that is safe enough that they can't bring everything down or block themselves. And so for us, like we're almost there. We're getting close. But it started out much simpler than this, and the number of stuff we were returning from remote config was a lot smaller. We didn't use asset bundles for a while, and so all of this was just layered on top as a very iterative approach, which is kind of the crux of game development. So that'd be my advice. But happy to answer any questions, or feel free to reach out. and kind of talk about the why or the how. Yeah, it's been great. So
awesome. Thank you again, and thank you all for watching. Have a great rest of your day.